Sadomasochism is the giving and/or receiving of pleasure, often sexual, from acts involving the infliction or reception of pain or humiliation. A subset of Bdsm, practitioners of sadomasochism usually seek out sexual gratification from these acts, but often seek out other forms of pleasure as well. While the terms sadist and masochist specifically refer to one who either enjoys giving pain, sadist, or one who enjoys receiving pain, masochist, many practitioners of sadomasochism describe themselves as at least somewhat of a switch, or someone who can receive pleasure from either inflicting or receiving pain. The abbreviation S&M is often used for sadomasochism, although practitioners themselves normally drop the N and use the acronym SM or S/M. Sadomasochism is not considered a clinical paraphilia unless such practices lead to clinically significant distress or impairment for a diagnosis. Similarly, sexual sadism within the context of mutual consent should not be mistaken for acts of sexual violence or aggression. Sadomasochism. Etymology. The term sadomasochism is complicated by the diversity of intent in its application. These terms were often loosely used to refer to cruel individuals or those that brought misfortunes onto themselves. However, these definitions are misleading. Richters and colleagues, 2007, examined the common belief that people with sadomasochistic sexual interest are damaged or dangerous. Their research found that BDSM is simply a sexual interest, and it is not a pathological symptom of past abuse or difficulty with sex. The two words incorporated into this compound, sadism and masochism, were originally derived from the names of two authors. The term sadism is derived from the name of Marquis de Sade. Not only did he practice sexual sadism, he also wrote novels about these practices, best known as Justine. The term masochism was named after Leopold von Sacher-Masoch. He practiced masochism, and wrote novels expressing his masochistic fantasies. These terms were first selected as professional scientific terminology, identifying human behavioral phenomena, and intended for the classification of distinct psychological illnesses and/or malicious social and sexual orientations. The German psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing introduced the terms sadism and masochism into institutional medical terminology in his work New Forschungen auf dem Gebiet der Psychopathia Sexualis, New Research in the Area of Psychopathology of Sex in 1890. In 1905, Sigmund Freud described sadism and masochism in his Dreieabhandlungen zur Sexualtheorie, 3 papers on sexual theory as stemming from aberrant psychological development from early childhood. He also laid the groundwork for the widely accepted medical perspective on the subject in the following decades. This led to the first compound usage of the terminology in sadomasochism, Leroy and Sadomasochism by the Viennese psychoanalyst Isidor Isaac Sadger in his work Über den sadomasochistischen Komplex, regarding the sadomasochistic complex in 1913. In the later 20th century, BDSM activists have protested against these conceptual models. Not only were these models derived from the philosophies of two singular historical figures, but Freud and Krafft-Ebing were psychiatrists. Their observations on sadism and masochism were dependent on psychiatric patients, and their models were built on the assumption of psychopathology. BDSM activists argue that it is illogical to attribute human behavioral phenomena as complex as sadism and masochism to the inventions of two historic individuals. Advocates of BDSM have sought to distinguish themselves from widely held notions of antiquated psychiatric theory by the adoption of the initialized term, BDSM, as a distinction from the now common usage of those psychological terms, abbreviated as S&M. Distinction among the subdivisions of BDSM. The term sadomasochism has been loosely used to refer to the entire umbrella of BDSM. However, this is not accurate, as BDSM is a shorthand for the 3 main subdivisions of the culture, B and D, bondage and discipline, D/S, dominance and submission, and S&M, sadism and masochism. Bondage and discipline usually involves either physical or psychological restraint, formalized service and/or punishment, and sometimes sexual role-playing, such as costumes. Psychology. Historical perspective. Both terms were introduced to the medical field by German psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing in his 1886 compilation of case studies Psychopathia Sexualis. Pain and physical violence are not essential in Krafft-Ebing's conception, and he defined masochism, German Masochismus, entirely in terms of control. Sigmund Freud, a psychoanalyst and a contemporary of Krafft-Ebing, noted that both were often found in the same individuals, and combined the two into a single dichotomous entity known as sadomasochism, German Sadomasochismus, often abbreviated as S&M or S/M. This observation is commonly verified in both literature and practice. Many sadists and masochists define themselves as switchable, capable of taking pleasure in either role. However, it has also been argued, Deleuze, coldness and cruelty, that the concurrence of sadism and masochism in Freud's model should not be taken for granted. Freud introduced the terms primary and secondary masochism. Though this idea has come under a number of interpretations, in a primary masochism the masochist undergoes a complete, not just a partial, rejection by the model or courted object, or sadist, possibly involving the model taking a rival as a preferred mate. This complete rejection is related to the death drive in Freud's psychoanalysis, Todestrieb. In a secondary masochism, by contrast, the masochist experiences a less serious, more feigned rejection and punishment by the model. Secondary masochism, in other words, is the relatively casual version, more akin to a charade, and most commentators are quick to point out its contrivedness. Rejection is not desired by a primary masochist in quite the same sense as the feigned rejection occurring within a mutually consensual relationship, or even where the masochist happens to be the one having actual initiative power. This is the confusion of the distinctions of casual appearance and discrete motives which underlies the analyses of Deleuze and Sartre, for example. And things hidden, since the foundation of the world. René Girard attempts to resuscitate and reinterpret Freud's distinction of primary and secondary masochism, in connection with his own philosophy. Both Krafft-Ebing and Freud assumed that sadism in men resulted from the distortion of the aggressive component of the male sexual instinct. Masochism in men, however, was seen as a more significant aberration, contrary to the nature of male sexuality. Freud doubted that masochism in men was ever a primary tendency, and speculated that it might exist only as a transformation of sadism. Sadomasochism in women received comparatively little discussion, as it was believed that it occurred primarily in men. Both also assumed that masochism was so inherent to female sexuality that it would be difficult to distinguish as a separate inclination. Havelock Ellis, and Studies in the Psychology of Sex, argued that there is no clear distinction between the aspects of sadism and masochism, and that they may be regarded as complementary emotional states. He also made the important point that sadomasochism is concerned only with pain in regard to sexual pleasure, and not in regard to cruelty, as Freud had suggested. In other words, the sadomasochist generally desires that the pain be inflicted or received in love, not in abuse, for the pleasure of either one or both participants. This mutual pleasure may even be essential for the satisfaction of those involved. Here Ellis touches upon the often paradoxical nature of widely reported consensual S&M practices. It is described as not simply pain to initiate pleasure, but violence or the simulation of involuntary violent acts said to express love. This irony is highly evident in the observation by many that not only are popularly practiced sadomasochistic activities usually performed at the express request of the masochist, but that it is often the designated masochist who may direct such activities, through subtle emotional cues perceived, or mutually understood, and consensually recognized by the designated sadist. And his essay Coldness and Cruelty, originally Présentation des Sadomasoches, 1967, Gilles Deleuze rejects the term sadomasochism as artificial, especially in the context of the quintessentially modern masochistic work, Sadomasochism Venus in Furs. Deleuze's counter-argument is that the tendency toward masochism is based on intensified desire brought on, or enhanced by the acting out of frustration at the delay of gratification. Taken to its extreme, an intolerably indefinite delay is rewarded by punitive perpetual delay, manifested as unwavering coldness. The masochist derives pleasure from, as Deleuze puts it, the contract, the process by which he can control another individual and turn the individual into someone cold and callous. The sadist, in contrast, derives pleasure from the law, the unavoidable power that places one person below another. The sadist attempts to destroy the ego in an effort to unify the id and superego, in effect gratifying the most base desires the sadist can express while ignoring, or completely suppressing the will of the ego, or of the conscience. Thus, Deleuze attempts to argue that masochism and sadism arise from such different impulses, that the combination of the two terms is meaningless and misleading. A masochist's perception of their own self-subjugating sadistic desires and capacities are treated by Deleuze as reactions to prior experience of sadistic objectification, for instance in terms of psychology, compulsively defensive appeasement of pathological guilt feelings as opposed to the volition of a strong free will, as in the epilogue of Venus in Furs, which shows the character of Severin has become embittered by his experiment in the alleged control of masochism, and advocates instead the domination of women. Before Deleuze, however, Sartre had presented his own theory of sadism and masochism, at which Deleuze's deconstructive attack, which took away the symmetry of the two roles, was probably directed. Because the pleasure or power, in looking at the victim figures prominently in sadism and masochism, Sartre was able to link these phenomena to his famous philosophy of the look of the other. Sartre argued that masochism is an attempt by the for itself, consciousness, to reduce itself to nothing, becoming an object that is drowned out by the abyss of the other subjectivity. By this Sartre means that, given that the for itself desires to attain a point of view in which it is both subject and object, one possible strategy is to gather and intensify every feeling and posture in which the self appears as an object to be rejected, tested, and humiliated, and in this way the for itself strives toward a point of view in which there is only one subjectivity in the relationship, which would be both that of the abuser and the abused. Conversely, of course, Sartre held sadism to be the effort to annihilate the subjectivity of the victim. That means that the sadist is exhilarated by the emotional distress of the victim, because they seek a subjectivity that views the victim as both subject and object. This argument may appear stronger, if it is understood that this look of the other theory is either only an aspect of the faculties of desire, or somehow its primary faculty. This does not account for the turn that Deleuze took for his own theory of these matters, but the premise of desire as look is associated with theoretical distinctions always detracted by Deleuze, in what he regarded as its essential error, to recognize desire as lack, which he identified in the philosophical temperament of Plato, Socrates, and Lacan. For Deleuze, insofar as desire is a lack, it is reducible to the look. Finally, after Deleuze, René Girard included his account of sadomasochism and things hidden, since the foundation of the world, originally des choses cachées depuis la fondation du monde, 1978, making the chapter on masochism a coherent part of his theory of mimetic desire. In this view of sadomasochism, the violence of the practices are an expression of a peripheral rivalry that has developed around the actual love object. There is clearly a similarity to Deleuze, since both in the violence surrounding the memory of mimetic crisis and its avoidance, and in the resistance to affection that is focused on by Deleuze, there is an understanding of the value of the love object in terms of the processes of its valuation, acquisition and the test it imposes on the suitor. Modern psychology. There are a number of reasons commonly given for why a sadomasochist finds the practice of S&M enjoyable, and the answer is largely dependent on the individual. For some, taking on a role of compliance or helplessness offers a form of therapeutic escape from the stresses of life, from responsibility, or from guilt. For others, being under the power of a strong, controlling presence may evoke the feelings of safety and protection associated with childhood. They likewise may derive satisfaction from earning the approval of that figure. See servitude, Bdsm. A sadist, on the other hand, may enjoy the feeling of power and authority that comes from playing a dominant role, or receive pleasure vicariously through the suffering of the masochist. It is poorly understood, though, what ultimately connects these emotional experiences to sexual gratification, or how that connection initially forms. Dr. Joseph Merlino, author and psychiatry advisor to the New York Daily News, said in an interview that a sadomasochistic relationship, as long as it is consensual, is not a psychological problem. It's a problem only if it is getting that individual into difficulties, if he or she is not happy with it, or it's causing problems in their personal or professional lives. If it's not, I'm not seeing that as a problem. but assuming that it did, what I would wonder about is what is his or her biology that would cause a tendency toward a problem, and dynamically, what were the experiences this individual had that led him or her toward one of the ends of the spectrum. Joseph Merlino. It is usually agreed on by psychologists that experiences during early sexual development can have a profound effect on the character of sexuality later in life. Sadomasochistic desires, however, seem to form at a variety of ages. Some individuals report having had them before puberty, while others do not discover them until well into adulthood. According to one study, the majority of male sadomasochists, 53%, developed their interest before the age of 15, while the majority of females, 78%, developed their interest afterwards. Breslow, Evans, and Langley 1985. The prevalence of sadomasochism within the general population is unknown. Despite female sadists being less visible than males, some surveys have resulted in comparable amounts of sadistic fantasies between females and males. The results of such studies demonstrate that one's sex does not determine preference for sadism. Psychological categorization. The classification of sadism and masochism has always been separate. Sadism was included in DSM in 1952, while masochism was added in DSM II in 1968. Contemporary psychology continues to identify sadism and masochism separately, and categorizes them as a practiced as a lifestyle or b as a medical condition. In the current DSM, sadism and masochism, alongside certain other sexual practices, are classified as paraphilious. Since the publication of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-4, in 1994, the current criteria for sadism and masochism as a paraphilia include that the fantasies, sexual urges, or behaviors must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. The manual's most current edition, DSM-4 TR, has not changed the 1994 criteria for masochism. The activity must be the sole means of sexual gratification for a period of 6 months, and either cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, or involve a violation of consent, to be diagnosed as a paraphilia. The criteria for sadism has had minor wording changes. The other major international classification of mental disorders, the ICD-10, differs from the DSM in a few regards. The ICD-10 combines sexual sadism and masochism into sadomasochism, makes more of a marked distinction between consensual sadomasochistic practices and sexual violence, and suggests that aspects of sadomasochism occur within average sexual relations. The DSM's criteria for sadism and masochism has been criticized as vague and untested in real-life circumstances. The inclusion of paraphilias as a whole in the DSM has been a point of debate within the field. One concern is the ambiguous criteria for distinction between common sexual activities with the criteria for paraphilia. Others believe the inclusion of many paraphilias rest on conventional perceptions of normal sexuality, and compare the inclusion of paraphilias like sadomasochism to that of homosexuality, which has been removed. 21. The latest version of the DSM will be published in May 2013, so it remains to be seen if any changes in diagnosis and criteria will happen. Needs update. Forensic classifications. Sexual masochists. Class I, bothered by, but not seeking out, fantasies. Maybe preponderantly sadists with minimal masochistic tendencies and or non-sadomasochistic with minimal masochistic tendencies. Class II, equal mix of sadistic and masochistic tendencies. Like to receive pain, but also like to be dominant partner, in this case, sadists. Sexual orgasm is achieved without pain or humiliation. Class III, masochists with minimal to no sadistic tendencies. Preference for pain and or humiliation, which facilitates orgasm, but not necessary to orgasm. Capable of romantic attachment. Class IV, exclusive masochists, that is, cannot form typical romantic relationships, cannot achieve orgasm without pain or humiliation. Sexual sadists. Class I, bothered but don't act out sexual fantasies. Class II, act on sadistic urges with consenting sexual partners, masochists or otherwise. Categorization as led to sadism is outdated. Class third, act on sadistic urges with non-consenting victims, but don't seriously injure or kill. May coincide with sadist sexual type rapists. Class fourth, only act with non-consenting victims, and will seriously injure or kill them. Difference between I second and third fourth is consent. 22. History. The term BDSM is commonly used to describe consensual activities that contain sadistic and masochistic element. Masochists tend to be very specific about the types of pain they enjoy, preferring some and disliking others. Many behaviors such as spanking, tickling and love bites contain element of sadomasochism. Even if both parties legally consent to such acts, this may not be accepted as a defense against criminal charges. Very few jurisdictions will permit consent as a legitimate defense if serious bodily injuries are caused. In extreme cases, sadism and masochism can include fantasies, sexual urges or behavior which cause observably significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, to the point that they can be considered part of a mental disorder. However, this is widely considered to be rare, as psychiatrists now regard such behaviors as clinically aberrant, only if they are identifiable as symptoms and/or associated with other problems such as personality disorder and/or neurosis. There is some controversy in the psychology professions regarding a personality disorder referred to alternately as self-defeating personality disorder or masochistic personality disorder, where masochistic behavior may not be in relation to other diagnosed mental disease. Sadism and masochism, in the context of consensual sexual activities, are not strictly accurate terms. Strictly speaking, a sadist is someone who enjoys causing pain regardless of whether the victim consents to it. Likewise, a masochist is someone who fantasizes about, or enjoys being beaten, sexually humiliated, bound, tortured, or otherwise made to suffer in all situations. Within BDSM, a sadist will not inflict pain on people who have not consented. Most masochists do not enjoy pain outside BDSM. Ernulf and Inala, 1995, observed discussions among individuals with such interests, one of whom described the goal of hyperdominance. 23. And popular culture. Sadism and masochism in fiction. This section does not cite any references or sources. Please help improve this section by adding citations to reliable sources. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. January 2012. Many works in literature and other media explore sadism and masochism. Among the more notable works are many of Marquis de Sade's books, including Justine, 1791, Juliet, 1797, and The 120 Days of Sodom, published posthumously in 1905, are written from a cruelly sadistic viewpoint. Leopold von Sacher-Masoch's novel Venus in Furs, 1870. Pauline Rage's novel Story of O, 1954. Isaac Julien's short dialogue-free film The Attendant, 1993. Anne Rice wrote the Sadomasochistic trilogy The Claiming of Sleeping Beauty, 1983-85, under the pseudonym of A. N. Rockwell, or An Exit to Eden, 1985, under the pseudonym of Anne Rampling. Rihanna's #1 song, S&M, 2011. 50 Shades of Grey Book Series 11. 50 Shades of Grey Book Series 11. 50 Shades of Grey Book Series 11.